The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. It's been more than 12 years since passenger rail on Vancouver Island ground to a halt. Back in the 19th century, governments gave away around 2 million acres on southeastern Vancouver Island as an incentive to get the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway built. Now, it sits abandoned. But the unbroken 289-kilometer corridor stretching from Esquimalt into Courtenay is still almost entirely intact. In March, a small portion of the land was returned to the Snanawas First Nation. At the same time, the provincial government announced it would provide $18 million to study the future of the corridor. The rest of the land is owned by the Island Corridor Foundation, a registered charity governed by a board of 12 directors, 6 of whom represent regional districts and 6 of whom represent First Nations. Warren Skolrud created the website and Facebook page Restore Island Rail. He's also created a petition calling on the federal government to work with the province and create a $1 billion fund to bring modernized passenger and freight rail to the corridor.
I'm Warren Skolrud. I've been working for the Department of National Defense for the last 35 years. I'm about to retire, actually. I do want to just say that I don't speak for DND on this issue. I'm speaking from my own personal learning and everything else. I live up in Shawnigan, which is the traditional territory of the Cowichan tribes. And that means something to me, in many ways, because the Island Corridor Foundation was actually started by them. It was a conversation with them, the other nations. They got together with the regional districts to form the ICF, and, they obtained the railway, and ever since then, they've been trying to get funding for it.
And what's prompted you to create a petition now to restore Island Rail?
Yeah, so last year, the federal government and the BC government weren't really paying any attention to the railway. I had a situation here where I had a woman ask me to park her trailer on my lot here so she could afford to live, because she couldn't move farther away from work because the cost of the drive and all that stuff, but she couldn't afford an apartment or anything like that. I had to turn her down because the CRD or CVRD rules don't allow, somebody living in my front yard like that. But when I calculated out, I looked at child tax benefits and everything else that she would have been receiving, because she told me how much she made. And, I just put that into a quick calculator you do for any finance thing. And she was right. She could not afford a place to live. And she was forced to drive because there's no other reasonable transit service around the island. It's pretty pathetic. If you get out of Victoria, it gets worse and worse up until Parksville. And then there's just nothing north of that, nothing that goes to Port Alberni. And so when I actually heard from an old family friend ages ago when they were pumping their petition, the Vancouver Island Transportation Corridor Coalition. They had a petition going, but it was kind of stuck at 1467. I decided to use the skills and abilities I've built up over the last, actually 41 years in total in IT and video production and image creation, all that kind of stuff. I decided to put, I was just going to, hey, I got $100. I'll set up a website and, set up a Facebook page, see if I can help them pump this petition up. And we got it up when it got up to 5,000. I was told that the BC government came and started talking to the Island Corridor Foundation about what was going on. By the time it got to 6,000, Omar Agrabah at the time, he was our federal transportation minister, came out and went through everything. That petition continued to grow until it got to 10,400. But of course, on the 14th of March, we ended up getting the announcement. They recognized the strategic significance of the corridor for the island's future and talked about our population was going to be up to 1 million by 2030. And but at the same time, they gave the Snanawas back their land up in the news. And so, everybody took that as a big blow. And all of a sudden, the advocacy I was seeing around for the railway was dropping. So I actually had a look at the land that was returned to the Sonawas, and there is a way to bypass that 1 mile piece. It's only 1 mile, and it skims right along the highway easement there. There's a good engineer could figure that out in no time. I realized, and looking at all of the other stuff, associated with the railway, like the old Dayliner was run backwards. It was run on a terrible schedule. A 56-year-old Bud train. CP and Rail America had deferred maintenance for decades before they left. So when the Island Corridor Foundation picked it up, it was already in bad shape. So there was no way they were going to bring the income in on a railway that was like limited use. The trains have to go very slow because of the condition of the tracks and everything else. So they weren't able to make a profitable business out of that would be able to pay for the replacement of the entire railway. Like that was not going to happen. So after the 14th, I went this is not the end of the railway. Like I know that the Island Corridor Foundation is made up of 14 First Nations and 5 regional districts. So we're not talking about, a private company like that Island Rail Corp that tried to pop up where the First Nations are not involved. This is a big group of people that are trying to figure out how to get the thing funded and how to make it work for the nations as well. And if you know anything about organizational dynamics, an organization with 12 directors, half of them being First Nations, half of them being regional district representatives, is going to be difficult. And it's going to take a long time to get from point A to point B. A lot of people disparage ICF and say, well, they haven't been able to get it done. Well, a complex organization like that, where they're trying to come up with a shared vision, and they did. They've got a business case out, the one that was costed at $431 million. So I know that what they represent is a healthy solution for the island. They're not talking about bringing the Dayliner back. They're talking about a proper train service that'll get people in Nanaimo to Victoria to Nanaimo, in the morning, and then opposite on the way back, so that they can go back and forth. Down in Victoria, they're talking about a commuter service between Langford and Victoria, where just before the Blue Bridge, right, where all the trails start and everything else. They're talking about freight moving from Port Alberni to the Port of Nanaimo. They don't specifically talk too much about the details of that because this is a business case, not a business plan. So anyway, when I saw the people kind of looking at it saying it's over, I said, no, it's not over. If the federal government had come in with appropriate funding, I think we would have trains right now.
This is Mid-Coast Morning. Today on the show, we're talking about the Island Rail Corridor. That was Warren Skolrud, who started a petition calling on the federal government to work with the province and create a $1 billion fund to bring modern passenger and freight rail service to the island. There's also a group calling for the rail corridor to be turned into a trail. Friends of Rails to Trails Vancouver Island Chair Alistair Craighead spoke to me about the case for that proposal.
Well, the corridor is there. The corridor is unused. And pretty well all over the world, especially in Europe and North America, the use of these corridors that's usually made when they're unused is an active transportation route, we now call it. But the other name for that is a multi-use trail. There's one actually in Pennsylvania called the Great Allegheny Passage. It's also an old coal railway for the most part, some canal, but it's about the same length as the corridor we have, the Island Corridor. It used to be called the E&N Corridor, about the same length, has about the same population characteristics, and it brings in about 1.5 million visitors a year and generates about 150 million in revenue in 1 year. So it's a very good revenue generator. The corridor is such a valuable asset. It really has to be used. It's been sitting unused for about 13 years now. There's no prospect at all for rail because the First Nations that the corridor goes through, the First Nations reservations, one of the First Nations has already got their land back, and about, I think, 4 others are on that track to get their land back too. So the railway corridor is finished with the railway corridor. it can still continue as a transportation corridor because a trail can go around the First Nations reserves. It does in Victoria, in the capital region. The First Nations wanted to use the corridor land on the reserve, so we put the ENN trail in the capital region around the reserve, and it works very well that way. So we could do that with the whole corridor.
And part of the reason that the railway service stopped in the first place was concern with safety of some of the bridges, etc. What would the cost be? Presumably some of those would still need to be addressed even if this was a trail. What would the cost be of turning this corridor into a trail?
Well, the cost to turn it into a trail would be, I've got my press release here with numbers on it. It would cost about $595,000, a bit more than that, per kilometre. Now, that seems like a lot of money, but the North Okanagan Trail, which is about a 50-kilometre trail, cost about the same. It was about 554, a little bit more. And, you know, that's what a trail costs these days. If you build a 4-metre wide trail, which is much wider than most of the trails that might have been built maybe 50 years ago, that's pretty well what it costs. That's to do a world-class trail that will attract people from all over the world.
Are there sections of the corridor that you feel could still have use as rail, as commuter service? For example, say between Victoria and Langford, an area that traffic-wise deals with a lot of congestion. Are there parts of the corridor that you feel still are a little more viable than the whole thing overall?
It's questionable whether there's any of the corridor viable for a modern railway. There was a study done in 1996, I happened to be involved in it, that looked at the route, for instance, for light rail transit in Victoria. It wasn't on the ENN corridor. It was on the corridor that the highway takes. And the highway is on that corridor for a reason, because it connects up the population centres that are growing in Victoria. The highway between Langford and Victoria goes through 3 or 4 population nodes like Helmicken, View Royal, Town and Country, Uptown. They're all growth points. The old ENN corridor goes through Esquimalt, which is a fairly low density settlement pattern, doesn't have any growth centres really. So that's why all the investment that's likely to go into transportation is going to be on the same corridor as the highway. And the Galloping Goose right-of-way actually is also on that corridor. And there was an agreement when the Galloping Goose was created. That's a very successful trail in Victoria. You may know about it. When that corridor was created for the trail, there is an agreement that part of that right-of-way can be used for LRT. Currently, the investment in Victoria in the capital region is going into express buses on dedicated bus lanes on the highway. That's where the money's going. It's not going into a rail on the ENN corridor. And it's very successful in cutting the time between Victoria and the Western communities. Very successful. And that's where the future investment is going to go until the Western communities are big enough to justify LRT. The LRT will then run on the same route as these dedicated bus lanes. And that's basically what's supported by the province. That's supported by BC Transit. There's no plan to put the LRT on the ENN corridor.
You're listening to Midcoast Morning. We'll be right back to the interviews in a moment.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHLY's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
We're talking the Island Rail Corridor on today's program. The Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway stopped running years ago, but the nearly 300-kilometer stretch of land from Esquimalt through Courtney is still almost entirely intact. We just heard from Alistair Craighead of Friends of Rails to Trails Vancouver Island, whose group argues in favor of turning the old railway line into a paved trail. Warren Skolrud recently created a petition to the federal government calling on them to work with the province to fund modernized freight and passenger rail service on the corridor. I asked him what he makes of the idea of turning it into a trail.
There's already 105 kilometers of trails beside the rails now. So basically everywhere that's heavily populated, they've already made a trail. So what they're talking about doing is lifting up the rails so that they can interconnect those to make a big long trail. Well, I always say to them, well, what's wrong with the Canada Trail? Like that trail's there. It uses the old rail line as well. It goes across the Kensal Trestle there. I enjoy that trail. I love it. I also see some motorcycles using it as a highway, but in general, it's a nice trail to go on. That railway wasn't needed. That piece of the railway wasn't needed. So you're talking about Friends of Rails to Trails because they're the ones that actually put in the RFP I guess an RFP to figure out how much it would cost to actually have a trail. And it was a Class C estimate, which first of all it's tantamount to a guess, in terms of what it produced. So what they said is $172 million to create this trail. But in that document, they specifically state that lifting the rails, remediating the ballast, taking out all the ties was not included in that pricing. So let's say they go ahead and they pay that money, but then the trestles need to be fixed fully, whether it is a trail or rails, because you can't take a bridge and half fix it. It has to be restored to its original spec. You can't put a 2x2 in the place of a 2x4 kind of thing, right? So that expense is going to be Kensal Trestle with the top was $9 million to do that one trestle. So if the railway fails, and then all of a sudden the idea is to put in this massive trail, they're going to have money to fix every one of those trestles right away, because the rules now for if there's a change of use, the railway has to come up. Actually, there has to be an environmental test first. They have to go every 500 meters to test the ground. And then they've got to rip up the rails, rip up the ties, take up the ballast and try to figure out what you're going to do with that before they put the trail in, right? It would be a massive amount of money. And then, if they're talking about paving the whole thing, what's the trail up the Saanich side there that's now buckling? The asphalt that they put on top of it is actually buckling and it's not getting maintained. And so riders are now, going over some rough spots. I saw a few people's posts about that. And so you're talking about a 289 kilometer trail that needs nothing but maintenance. It has no direct revenue stream. Like, what is the direct revenue stream when you're on an island already that has the Trans-Canada Trail and all of the other trails and activities and everything else we have? They like to say that it's going to bring in a whole bunch of tourists and we're going to make money off of that, the cyclists and whatnot. Well, they already come. They already come here. They already do cycle all over the island. There may be a quick, let's say they did actually find somebody to invest that much money in the trail. There may be a quick little burst of people that want to come on and check it out. But I think that would die off pretty quick afterwards, right? So all we're left with at the end of that is a trail that needs to be maintained. And it's probably going to end up with a bunch of tent cities along the side of it. So it's probably going to need to be policed as well, and with no revenue stream. So at least with the rails, there's the freight revenue to maintain the tracks from into the future.
Why do you think we've managed to go over a decade with the railway being largely completely in disuse?
Well, I I look back and I try to think myself as the government looking at our railway at that point in time. So that the years preceding 2011, there was actually a reduction in the growth rate on Vancouver Island. So it was looking like we weren't going to be getting more and more people in. But of course, right after 2011, it started spiking up. And, we've gone up 180,000 people since 2011. And so I did, I do weird calculations sometimes. I figured out the length of the entire railway. I divided that by the average arm span of a person. And they could actually stand along the entire railway holding hands, all 289 kilometers of it. So today, it's a different picture than it was in 2011. Today, we're looking at mass, even more growth. By 2030, it'll be a difference of 240,000 people. And they're coming from all different places that already have rail, that have transit systems where people are used to using trains and buses and things like that. And it's not just buses at endpoints, right? And it's also not the entire railway. People go back and forth on little sections as well. There's 80% of the 900,000 people that live on Vancouver Island now live within 5 kilometers of the railway. And I've confirmed that using GIS because I was questioning that myself for a while. So the catchment is actually huge for this railway. It's just the problem is the only measure we have of that is the old 56-year-old bud train running on a tourist schedule, backwards to commuting needs.
Is there anything else you'd like to bring to the conversation today?
I just really hope that people will, think this really through. And there's a lot of one-off, I get it. Everybody's heads are down, working their butt off, just trying to make rent. Everything's gotten more expensive now. You can't reduce the price of your food. You can only eat less food. You can't reduce the price of your clothing and everything else that you're buying right now. There's just no way of doing that. You can't reduce your rent. The only thing that we have positive control over is our transportation, really, how we get to places. And if you can use an inexpensive transit service that's actually quite comfortable, like you look at a train compared to even a bus. I mean, you're not being jostled around. It's not a stop-start. You're not driving on the roads with all the other traffic. If you get stuck in traffic, you're stuck in the bus. You're on a comfortable, lengthy train that has bathrooms and things on board. Like if you're a senior, the trips between bathrooms get shorter and shorter as you get older. And, I can attest to that. So I hope that people can see through the fog and, sign this petition and get our message to government that they need to keep looking at this. They need to work with First Nations and actually make, with concerted effort and make this work and then fund it. I put up $1 billion, which is nothing compared to the rest of Canada. I mean, I looked at the hiring pages for rail, and there's over $108 billion worth of projects on the books today. And Vancouver Island now represents 149th of 143rd of Canadian population, and also 1/5 of BC's population. We're not the little small island that some people think we are. We usually stay within a small bubble of our lives, and we don't see everybody else that's out there. But 900,000 people is a lot of people, and with so many of them in and along the railway, and the opportunity, to access construction funds for low-income housing along transit corridors, well, build a transit corridor, and those developers will come. So hopefully people will get in there, sign, let's get these numbers up. Let's get the message through to Ottawa that this railway is a strategic asset, and it's not just needed tomorrow, it's needed today.
Warren Skolrud created the page Restore Island Rail, as well as a petition to the federal government on the issue, which has gathered more than 4,400 signatures as of recording time. Meanwhile, Alistair Craighead of Friends of Rails to Trails Vancouver Island says the one thing everyone can agree on is the value of keeping the corridor intact, one way or another.
Well, I think what's really important, and the characteristics of the corridor that are really important, are it's continuous. We don't want to see the corridor broken. Everybody agrees on that. Even people that think rail is a good idea, they all agree the corridor is a hugely valuable asset. And what's really important when you're constructing and investing in a trail is it be continuous. There are still people saying, well, we should leave the rails in place. we can have the trail with the rails. Well, we can't. There's no room on the bridges. There's 40 bridges at least 40 bridges between Victoria and Comox, depending on where you start the trail. There's no room on these bridges. If you have to construct another bridge to have the trail besides rails that aren't even used, that would put the cost into, we don't even need to calculate that. We can look at where that's been done in Victoria. There is a trail beside the rails, but that trail was built at a cost of more than $2 million a kilometre, not the $500 million that the trail would cost. And to build a trail all the way up the island for $2 million a kilometre, I don't think that would happen. So we then have an unused corridor, and then we'd have all sorts of demands to develop it in some other way. So we don't want to lose it. The trail is a default solution that's proven all over North America, Europe, and other parts of the world too. So we understand that the default solution is the one that we should use. Successful default solution is the one that we should go for.
We also reached out to the Island Corridor Foundation, the registered charity which owns the land the corridor is on, but couldn't arrange an interview ahead of our deadline. That's our story for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom and more. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you would like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.